Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tevach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rina Lights LLC and is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Hashalom, and Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav Hashalom, and Rabbi Yael HaKohen Khan Olav Hashalom. It's also schus and merit Rab Zev Yecheskel HaKohen and Risha Katz Le'erich Yomim V'Shanim Tevis for many long, healthy years. So we're in chapter 10, the chapter about the Tzaddik. And we discussed in the last year at length the concept of a Tzaddik Gomer, the highest possible level of someone who is seamlessly and absolutely only a channel, a transparent channel for godliness. And there's no room, not even an inch, for anything that's the opposite or anything that's not godly. It doesn't have to even be the opposite. In the example used in chapter 9, that the king conquering the city has not just conquered the city, has not just established control and has allies, but every individual, every citizen in the city, every faculty in the nimshal and the moral is aligned, not only neutral, not only not resisting and not opposing, but completely aligned. Everybody has been transformed. A tzaddik she'eino gomer is someone that still has complete control, but still not everything has been completely transformed. So the beginning of the chapter, we learned the tzaddik she'eino gomer, or what's called the tzaddik v'ralei. There's still a ra, not actual ra, nothing that actually opposes and goes against God, because this tzaddik has full control. He doesn't have, his faculties are completely controlled by the divine soul, and that's that. But there's still not total transformation, as we discussed. When he said, let's say, Eineid Milvade. Eineid Milvade means there's nothing but God. In this case, there is God, is the controlling force, the divine soul, but yet there are still elements where there's a certain residual indifference, if you wish. So to understand the Tzaddik She'eino Gomer, the Alter Rebbe now goes into understanding the Tzaddik Gomer. And that's what we shall continue learning inside. So he says like this. So let's learn together. We're now in the first, in the Ubir Inyan. So after the opening of the Perek, which talks about to the point that he eliminates and expels and annihilates all negativity from his left side, to the point that it gets transformed. So there is the level of the tzaddik she'eino gomer, or tzaddik v'ralei. It says the hainu sheyesh bo adayin ma'at mizeir ra b'chol asmoli, but it's kofel for bottle l'teiv machmes miyute. So now he says ubire inyan, to understand that, well, we have to contrast it, and he's now going to take us on a journey into the tzaddik gomer. Ubire inyan ki hinei tzaddik gomer shenepach harash alei l'teiv. The tzaddik gomer, the complete tzaddik, whose evil has been transformed to good. And remember, the word evil doesn't mean necessarily actual evil. It means anything that's not godly has been transformed to good. Which is why he's called the tzaddik who is it's good. Not just good, it means here, like we said, that everything is good. There's no negative at all. Everything is totally good. And how is that he comes to that level? So how did he actually transform it? So he now explains something we learned earlier about the garments. He says he did this, hu al yedei hasoras habgodim atzeim legamri mara. He achieved this transformation through completely removing the evil soiled garments. Remember, the divine soul is fundamentally divine in its very personality, its faculties, its garments as well. So to be any type of toxic behavior cannot be in the divine soul. It has to be in the garments that the human being dresses in. So the human being can be very clean, but you could dress yourself in dirty garments, what he calls soiled garments. But in the case of the Tzaddik Gomor, what did he do? Anything that manifests in the worldly pleasures, which is the soiled garments of the animal soul, has completely been eliminated. He's completely eliminated that. He removed those garments from him, so it doesn't exist anymore. The Tzaddik She'eina Gomer has also removed them, but he hasn't transformed them, as we're going to learn. So what does it mean he removed them? So here it goes back to the principle that we're not talking, there's no middle ground essentially when you're talking about the absolute terms. There's middle ground, the Tzaddik She'eina Gomer is middle ground in a way. But the Tzaddik Gomer, there's no middle ground, because anything that is not purely godly and holy is already, it means if you're not with me, you may not be against me, but you haven't been transformed, so there's something still, potential resistance, or something that remains that is residual that has to still be transformed. So how does the Tzaddik Gomer do it? What is he doing that the Tzaddik She'eina Gomer is not doing? So now he's going to dissect and explain the anatomy of this, the psychology of this Tzaddik Gomer. And this is what he says. This is how the removal of the garments. But before we go there, let's continue talking a bit about the garments. Remember, we learned that the animal soul has two components to it. Its very nature, the animal soul, what we call the koyach hamesava, its power to desire. And then the object of desire. That's when the animal soul dresses in garments that are not clean, polluted garments or soiled garments. What's happening? The power of desire in the animal soul, which in it of itself can be directed toward positive things, is now directed and dressing itself up in negative things. So obviously that is not the level of a tzaddik altogether. But for a person who's a tzaddik, what he's done is removed those garments. In other words, what remains is the animal soul, the pure koyach hamesaveh, which fundamentally is not a negative thing. In Likutei Torah Chukas, as we've quoted a few times, it says that the power of desire is actually rooted by Yisedose B'Harei Kodesh. It's rooted in the holy hills and mountains, meaning in the holy source. It's where the desire is directed. For example, when a tzaddik desires to learn Torah, or desires to love God, has a deep passion for godliness, it's also desire. So in the divine soul, the desire is completely divine. But the animal soul could also be directed. That's called the transformation. Like we learned at the end of the last chapter. So what has he done? He's removed the object of desire that is soiled, and he's dressed himself in an object of desire that is divine. Hence, the animal soul has now been transformed. That's the pshat, that's what he says, that by removing that, by removing those garments, that's why Nepach Harasha Le'Letev, that's why it's called a Tzaddik V'Tevle. Another point to be made, as we discussed at the end of chapter 9, he said that the animal soul in its essence doesn't want the person to follow what it's asking. It was appointed by God to tempt the person. But its ratzon is really l'tevaseh shel adam. It's for the purpose, it's for the good of the person that he should resist that temptation. So you see something furthermore in the animal soul. Besides the koyach hamesaveh, its power of desire, not necessarily being a negative, but could be directed toward positive things, that passion. In other words, if the animal soul understands that loving God, serving God, learning about godliness, living a godly life is good for it, in addition to that, that's really the ultimate intention. The Nefesh HaBamis is only tempting because he's a shliach of God and says, I need you to tempt the person. So you can imagine it's a double thing. When the person doesn't listen to the animal soul, meaning he removes these polluted, these soiled garments. So number one, the animal soul now can be directed its desire to positive things, holy things. Number two, you're actually fulfilling the deep essence of what the animal soul wants. It wants you not to listen to it. So it's actually like a simcha by the animal soul. So it comes alive, and it's not eliminated, it's transformed on both levels, both its power of desire and also its intentions. And that's ultimately what is the haficha. But what makes the tzaddik gomer different? Why does that tzaddik she'eino gomer not have this element when he's also eliminated? Ba'arta ra, we said. He removed ba'arta ra, everything negative from him, as we learned before, eliminating the evil from your midst. But still, he said, not complete transformation, because if it transformed it, because if he completely eliminated anything, it would have been transformed. So what's the difference? What's the difference between the two? So now he explains. The hainu. Here's the key thing that we're going to understand. Limois ma'id b'tainuga elam hazeh. He's deeply repulsed, disgusted, can be another word, by the pleasures of this world. A very strong word here. We're soon going to use the word sinna, which is despise, dislike, hate. But here he's using the word repulsed or disgusted by the pleasures of this world. That's the key thing. And we're going to learn in a moment, why is he disgusted? Why is he repulsed? Not only because, I should say, because the negative elements of the world degrade you, defile you. It's like somebody realizes, what am I going to be completely muddied up and dirtied and polluted by the toxins of this world? You're disgusted by that. Imagine a person falling into a puddle, dirty puddle. We're disgusted. It's not just we dislike it, we're disgusted. But furthermore, as we're going to learn, it's deeper than that. It's because he has such a deep love for God. So anything opposite disgusts him. And that's vital. Because to be disgusted by something, yes, okay, very disturbed, but why do some people have no problem being dirty? Because they got used to it. It becomes their standard. They don't have the other higher level of, if they understood what real love was for God, then anything opposite would be something that disgusts them, as we're going to learn shortly. So it disgusts him, elam hazeh, tainugim of elam hazeh. Limis ma'id b'tainug elam hazeh. Ma'oid, he says, deeply repulsed. In Torah Eir, Pasha Kesisa, he adds a lashon ma'id pirushe bli gvul. Yesem igdei midase, which means limes ma'id hu mias bli gvul kaloshan abin mias berra betachlis. So ma'id adds utter, total and utter disgust. Lisanik bom betainuges b'nei adam lamalis taivas aguv belvad. V'lo la'avedas Hashem. So the very notion of enjoying mortal and human pleasures purely to gratify the body, lamalis taivas aguv belvad, and not in the worship of God, not in the service of God, not la'avedas Hashem, that's what disgusts him. That's what repulses him. Why? Because that behavior and that activity is mipnei yesim nimshachim v'nishpoim ha'klipa v'sitra achra. Because these pleasures, where do they come from? They come from the klipa and sitra achra, the shell, and the other side, like we learned, doesn't have to be negative, it's just not godliness. It doesn't have that complete dedication to the purpose of existence. So it's completely out of the domain of this tzaddik. And as a result, any iota of that disgusts him. So it's interesting. In other words, he doesn't say here that it has to be a very decadent type of behavior. Even eating something kosher, even doing something that is permitted, but it's not being done completely for serving God, is a form of indulgence. That's the dover mos. That's limas ma'id. And he continues, since it's sitra achra, so v'kol mashu ma sitra achra tzaddik gomer huseine betachlis hasina. anything that comes from the other side, which means not the side of Kedusha, of holiness, this complete tzaddik, a tzaddik gomer, Seine betachas hasina, completely and utterly detests it. Now he brings sina, detests it. Machmas geidel avosei laHashem u'kedushasei. And here is the punchline. Why? So you could say he detests it because it just disgusts him, or detests him, or is detested by him. So he says, no, it's more than that. It's due to his profound love for God, Machmas geidel avosei laHashem u'kedushasei, and his holiness. Now some interpret Kedushasei goes on the Tzaddik, but the most basic interpretation is going on God. On God, for God and God's holiness. That's what he loves. He loves that sanctity, he loves that purity, he loves that transcendence. And as a result of the great love, at the end of chapter 9, with an exceptional love that is great and pleasurable, not just Ava Rabba, a very exceptional or intense love. B'tainugim, a great love. B'tainugim, with pleasures. V'chibi yeseda, an additional and an extra measure of love and affection. And Iskarim Leil mentioned above in chapter 9 at the end where he spoke about that's not just regular Ava love. It's this profound and intense love. That's what the tzaddik has such connection. So automatically, the more you love one side of things, the more you're going to despise and detest. And what you said, despise, detest, and ultimately will detest and despise and repulse. Be repulsed by and disgusted by the opposite. Why? Kis heim zel umazeh. This is critical. Why? Because if you don't say zel umazeh, which means God made one the opposite of the other, you could say maybe they're not opposites. Or even if they even though they may be two different entities, but they don't control. Why can't you have both? This person could love godliness and kedusha, and could also love this material world. You see this all the time. People learn Torah, they do mitzvahs, they enjoy it, and then they can indulge themselves in the material world. But we all know there's a famous expression from the Cheves HaLevavis that says you cannot love both. Just like fire and water cannot come together, the same thing, you cannot have both Kedusha and Klippa in the same, the words of the Cheves HaLevavis, it says like this, the Kashem she'efshe she'yishkenu ha'esh v'amayim b'klei echad. Fire and water cannot be together. Other things you can mix. You can mix water and oil. They don't mix really, but they won't annihilate each other. But fire and water can be in one keli. So in one heart you cannot have the love of God and the love of this world. If you do have both, it's compartmentalized either in different times, but it's not going because they're opposites of each other. That's what he says, because they're opposites of each other. So therefore, if you love one greatly, automatically you're going to despise and even more be repulsed by the other side. That's what the Alter Rebbe is adding. In this context, there's nothing neutral. We discussed about compartmentalizing and a neutral state. So Tzaddik She'eino Gomer, which we'll get back to, still doesn't have this intense love, and therefore doesn't have the opposite that eliminates any even iota or even residual from the material world. And how do we see this? Where do we know that a tzaddik gomer has this element? And now you also understand why he uses the word sin. He brings a pasuk, kediksiv, the book of Tehillim, Kuf Lamed Tes, Chav Beis and Chav Gimel, 139, 22, 23, kediksiv tachlis sina. Senesim la'evim hoyeli chokreini v'dei levavi v'gemer. That's what the Alter Rebbe brings. So he brings this pasuk. Translated, let's translate the pasuk. V'da levavi v'gemer. So the pasuk says like this: I utterly detest them. Not just sinah, tachlis sinah sinesim. They have become my enemies. And he says, probe me. Hashem, God, and know my heart. So he's not just stating it, he's actually saying, test me, evaluate, check it out. And the Alter Rebbe actually quotes that. In other words, not only is he making the statement, he's like establishing that God himself confirms that fact, which explains why he brings the second half of the verse. You could say, the point that's here is that he detests it. So you could just say, Tachlis sinesim la'ivim. La'ivim hayuli. What do you need to have? The chokreini v'da levavi. But it just confirms that it's also confirmed that it's an actual fact. It's not just that David is saying that's the case, even though David obviously can be believed. But it makes it much stronger because God ratifies it. So what do you have here? Tachlis sinah, the word sinah. But then, before we use the word mius, so we'll discuss that in a moment. Let me just continue reading. So now here goes the equation. So now that we've established, this is all to explain why the Tzaddik Gomer completely removes any soiled garments, because, like he said, to have any pleasure in this world, because anything that is not godly, and earlier he said the expression that limes ma'id b'tainuga elam hazeh, even more than sinna, even more than despises, that he's repulsed, he's disgusted. So now the Alter Rebbe concludes. So now that we know the reason for that is because of great love. And everything opposite is created opposites. Ukefi erech geidla aval Hashem, directly proportional to the level of his great love to God. Kach erech geidla hasina, so direct proportion to that is the intensity. He's saying of hasina l'sitra acher v'amius bera betachlis, detesting the other side, the sitra achra, and the complete repulsion, the outer repulsion for evil. And here he brings both expressions. So first point, let's just make it clear, since we're dealing with two polar opposites, so the more the love for one, the more you detest and repulsed by the other. If the love is not that intense, the repulsion will also be not that strong. And that's why if you don't really transform the enemy into an ally, even if the enemy is not an enemy any longer, it's neutral, it's a result because you don't have the complete love, and therefore you don't have the complete repulsion or detestment of the other side. It's one point. What is the difference between sinna and mius? The Alter Rebbe brings both expressions. So the commentaries on the Tanya explain it this way, that something you dislike is something that is more of like you dislike an ideology, something that really is opposite of the way you think. It's a more subtle element, something more spiritual, so to speak, which defies what you stand for. So you utterly detest it. Repulsion is something like, for example, when a person eats a food that's disgusting, you're ready to throw it up. That's far more, and that's usually something that's more tangible. So that one of the explanations given is that the difference between the two is that when you're talking about the more so-called, ethereal things that go against godliness, you detest it. It's like an enemy that you completely hate. Tachlis sinus sinesim, as he said. When you're talking about the physical world, remember, where did he use the word mius? Limas ma'id b'tainuga elam hazeh. Decided that he should take pleasure and indulge in taivas haguf. That's not toward direct, and there it's repulsive. So for most of us, physicality is not repulsive. But we all know there are things that repulse you. If you see something disgusting, it disgusts you. You're not going to say that about something spiritual. So you say something that is negative, an enemy, a molek, attacks us. It's not about repulsion. It's more, this is my enemy, and I detest my enemy. Or the enemy to God. Disgusting, he uses dafka the taiva selamaza. And by sinna, he says sitrache, la'ovim, that to my enemies. But what enemies are referring to? There, it's more subtle. Not that it's less of a negative thing, but it's not something where you disgust or you're repulsed by. But bottom line is, this is critical. The word hatred, or the word detest, or the word to be repulsed or disgusted sound like very negative words. And you could get the impression, reading this literally, that the tzaddik has this like very negative thing. He hates enemies, he detests them, he's repulsed by them. But no, when you read this closely, you see the opposite. No, the tzaddik is the most refined person. If you detest something, let's say you see someone who is hurting a child, and it makes your blood boil. You detest it, you're repulsed by it, however you define the differences. That's not coming because you're not refined. On the contrary, because you're so in love of things that are pure and you see it being defiled, you don't just remain aloof and indifferent. It repulses you. The fact that we're repulsed only by things that are disgusting on our terms is because we're physical creatures. By the tzaddik, his experience of the divine, his experience of the spiritual, of godliness, is so pure that anything not like it is something that is completely a sinner and a detesting and a repulsion. But not to be seen that that's his personality. Because that's the impression. People could say, oh, look at people who are so devout and so pious, and they're like disgusted by different things. It's not disgust, it's the beauty of his love. And that's what the Alter Rebbe says, Machmas Geidla Avose Lashem. Yes, it's true, from the point of view of Sur Merah, you could say, look how when a person behaves like an animal, God forbid, in a very low way, hedonistic behavior. So that can be repulsive because you see a person, it's like when you see someone who's been a refined person falls and behave in a way that, you see sometimes a very hungry person, so hungry, and then he eats in a way, you could have Rahmanas in him, but it's disgusting at times. Then here it's not just that element. On the contrary, it's mepnei machmas geidla avose laHashem. And since zelu mazeh, that's why anything not the love, when you love someone deeply, say anything that touches that love, even a small compromise is going to shake you to the core. If you don't love that much, it's not going to shake you so much. And that's how we have to understand these words. Hebrew is very important because sinah and mius can come across as very negative, but here we're talking about being disgusted and detesting things that are literally horrendous. No one's going to say, for example, when you see how the Nazis treated the Jews, we're disgusted by it. We're repulsed by it. We detest them. But not because we go into the mud, into a state of hatred. It's not because of the hatred. It's because we so love life and beauty. When you see someone behaving that way, it's repulsive, literally. And that's what he says here about the tzaddik. Now, of course, it continues, and there's more to be said about this. We'll continue learning next week. This program and all the previous programs can be found at TanyaApplied.com. Everyone have a good Tavach. Be well and be blessed.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.